welcome to the Novel Cohorts Podcast. This is Dan Hausman speaking, and I'm here with Jeff Wessinger from PointClickCare Life Sciences. As some of you know, we did a podcast with PointClickCare a few years back, and it's great to speak again because that was pretty much the beginning of the pandemic, and now we're a few years out from the end of the pandemic, and we can get a great update. Maybe be helpful to just introduce yourself, Jeff, and
Sure.
talk a little bit about PointClickCare for those of people in the audience who don't know much about you guys.
Yeah, happy to, Dan. Happy to join you again. It's been far too long. So PointClickCare is an organization that is primarily focused on the long-term care sector in the U.S. We are principally an EHR company with a purpose-built EHR for long-term care. That meaning skilled nursing facilities, assisted living facilities across the U.S. have a pretty significant market share, north of 80% in that space. And, our mission as a company is to help the world care for aging and vulnerable populations, right? So again, principally through the EHR, but more recently, we've started to make the data, chart level data available to researchers, again, to help understand this population and really make it better, and better in a number of ways. Really getting these patients, therapeutic solutions or better therapies than what they have now is a big part of it. So, I think that will lead us into, one of the topics we want to discuss today, which is, access to new therapies in long-term care, which, I think is something that we've started to help with. And I think there's a long way to go, but I think there's a big opportunity here to help, get some of these newer therapeutic options available in long-term care. But yeah, us as a company, that's what we do. We're a long-term care focused EHR company.
And I suppose you must have been looking at the data quite a bit, and it sounds like you found some gaps between standard of care in the general population and this population that from a life sciences perspective should be maybe considered opportunities, and from a patient perspective could be a big opportunity. Tell me more about what you've seen.
Yeah, I think there could be several reasons for it, but what we've noticed in the discrete data is that the uptake of new medications in long-term care seems to be lagging the general population. So when a new medication is released, it takes a significant amount of time for these medications to make their way into long-term care settings, right? Again, depending on the organization and the specific HCP, they do get access to them, but it does take a prolonged period of time before they reach sort of the level that the general population has. And there's a number of theories that we've come up with or reasons for that. The settings in nursing homes, rehab centers, they're typically focused on managing chronic conditions and maintaining a quality of life for residents. And so the introduction of new medications is less frequent, where cutting edge treatment are more commonly adopted in specialty clinics or hospitals, right? That's where a lot of the research is happening. That's where a lot of the clinical trials are happening. So, doctors who show a strong interest in a therapeutic area will participate in a clinical trial and have a high volume of prescribing as a result, and so in primary care settings, that's common, because, they have more frequent use, they're looking for innovative solutions, and, the settings are easy to demonstrate the potential benefits and of these new drugs. Conversely, in long-term care, the focus is often on just managing these conditions and, like I said, maintaining some quality of life. And so less frequent introduction of new medications. But I think looking at the success that these medications have had in primary care, there's an opportunity for medical directors and people in these facilities to be encouraged. New medications, and these advanced treatment options can certainly enhance the quality of life and really drive, that quality of care within long-term care if we start to look at that. And I think, Dan, the interesting question you asked me is this a coverage issue? And it really isn't. Like, a lot of these new medications, in fact, the vast majority of them are covered by Medicaid. And 80% of the population in these settings are dual eligible patients who do have full coverage for these therapies. So There's a lot of work to be done, but we're working with a lot of, the manufacturers, a lot of academic institutions, government organizations to really help solve this problem.
And why do you think it is that the market access, med affairs groups aren't pushing harder to do this? If there is reimbursement, you think they'd want to maximize the...
Yeah. And so they're starting to realize that, this is a pretty massive industry. There's about 2.5 million patients at any given time in long-term care, maybe just under that. So really it's a small population when you think about it, compared to the entire population of the US. However, they are a large volume percentage-wise of medication use. Most of these patients are on 8 to 10 medications at any given time. So, they consume a significant amount more of the drug therapies than the rest of the population. So if you think about them in that context, they're kind of the equivalent of a small country, right? But I think the market access people don't necessarily think of it that way now. They just look at the raw number in terms of patients and they're like, okay, that's just small. It's a rounding error. I'm not that worried about it. But in fact, it is a pretty big opportunity from a commercial perspective. And if you roll out the numbers, which we have done in many cases, and you say, if we just got, our natural market share within this space, it's, multiple millions of dollars, right? So then now, if you can make that case, they start to look at it. So that's where I think our data products have become, most desirable, is companies that can foresee that and see that there is that opportunity. And we've been monitoring the number of long-term care focused roles in life sciences over the last year. And it's gone from less than 100 to well over 500 LTC roles. So people that are focused on long-term care in pharma. And I hope we've had a little something to do with that, but they're starting to pay attention. And if you think about the demographics of this space, it's only growing, right? I mean, there's going to be 50% more people over the age of 65, even within the next 10 years. So it's not only big now, but it's going to be huge, in the next, 10, 15, 20 years.
And, you have so many different roles you can play because you have the EMR.
Mm-hmm.
I think you might be somewhat integrated into the facility landscape on the real estate side even. And you have your real-world data product. How does it work if someone comes up to you as a manufacturer and they have a drug? What do they do with you guys?
So the typical engagement is usually they look at a commercial use case first. So they have a drug in the market and they're interested in understanding, where the opportunities are for it to be utilized. So a good example is with tardive dyskinesia. We have a couple of clients that are in that space. It's a disease that's almost exclusively in long-term care. There's not a lot of TD patients that are outside of this type of setting just because of that specific disease. But the standard line of therapy within, our homes is not optimal. I mean, there are products now on the market that can control, the dyskinesia, can control, sort of the involuntary movements and the disorders associated with that. But the typical frontline treatment is to put them on an antipsychotic, right? And control them by putting them to sleep. And this is really not ideal. So, helping, caregivers understand that there are better therapeutic options, is something that these manufacturers want to do, but they need to understand where the standard of care, which specific organizations are not adopting this newer standard of care. And then they can target their education resources most appropriately. And the success story in the last couple of years in this space is we put over 3,000 new patients, TD patients, on newer medications that wouldn't have been without this intervention. So similarly in other therapeutic areas, that's the way to get in. Let's look at where exactly what I said, where the therapeutic deliverable is not, falls below the standard of care that it should be in commercial terms, where your market share is less than what you would expect. We would look at that specific situation and we would show you exactly where geographically that's happening, and then they can target their resources appropriately. We call that the commercial data set. So that's one. So that gives you very detailed geography, but not a lot of detailed clinical or outcomes information. That information, or the chart level patient data anonymized, goes into our clinical data set. So the clinical data set is basically, 50 plus observations per patient per day, that we provide without any identifying metrics. So you can't see, the facility or the address or the HCP, but you can follow this patient longitudinally over time. And then you can see things like efficacy, treatment patterns, that kind of thing. So that's the second product offering, is the clinical product offering. And that's quite a bit larger, but it's basically chart level information that's anonymized. And we go back to 2015 in terms of history. And as I said, about 6 million unique patients are going through these institutions on an annual basis. So you buy it either for the clinical use case or the commercial use case. Typically, our customers will buy commercial first, and then they'll move to clinical. In some cases, if they're pre-launch, they might buy clinical first, but they buy it by therapeutic area. So we would sell it for, a chronic disease like diabetes or tardive dyskinesia. And then, you basically pick a set of ICDs, you pick a product basket, and we give you the condition for all of that data.
So, I know a little bit about tardive dyskinesia.
Yeah.
And, I actually talked to some of the C-suite of one of these groups that offer these therapies at the Cowan conference. And, at least then they mentioned that the biggest challenge they have is the screening process to get patients sort of qualified. Because, once you've had, whether it's a psychiatrist or it's someone who's involved in the care of the patient, do the appropriate screening, it's not too hard to get them on therapy.
Right. Yeah.
Is the whole solution? Yeah. Is the whole solution just the, pointing to the right clinicians, or is there also more to it inside the EMR and other things?
So that's the unique thing, really, is that we're not completely dependent on the coding of the ICD, right? So there are many conditions that don't get coded. I'll give you another example. So there's a condition called age-related anorexia, which, is a formal ICD code, but it never gets coded. Right? Less than 0.1% of our patients have it coded. And really, the diagnosis is just, declining BMI over, 3, 6, 9-month periods, right? Caused by not eating, right? So a lot of times it gets improperly, diagnosed as wasting or just natural aging, when in fact, the problem, much like adolescent anorexia, is that they're not eating. So in our system, we have a dietary module which measures how much food they consume at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Is it 25%, 50, 75% of their meal? Just a simple metric like that gets point and clicked at by the caregiver. So we can correlate that with another metric that happens in our EHR, which is daily vitals. So we actually measure their weight on a daily basis. So we can look at declining BMI compared to dietary patterns, and we can say, okay, this person, lost 20% of their weight in the last 6 months, and they were eating 25% of what a normal intake would be. Therefore, they should have the ICD, but don't. So we can create a proxy for diagnosis, for symptoms in many cases where it doesn't get coded. Another popular one is for agitation. Agitation is actually an ICD as well, but never gets coded as agitation. But we code a number of things in the EHR, right? Say that there was abusive staff, or whether there was a resident fight or something, or there was a hallucinogenic incident. We code that as a symptom, so we can actually take symptoms and we can count the number of sort of events that happen that are agitation by definition, where there's no ICD. So again, if you have an agitation drug or an Alzheimer's agitation drug, you don't just want to see the agitation diagnosis and the dementia diagnosis. You may want to see the symptom diagnosed as well, and we can give you that too.
So, I'm obsessed with translation. So if you find something and there's a treatment in the real world data side, it sounds like you have the capacity. If you take this example of an anorexia incident or case, yet it's not coded.
Right.
Now you have a new treatment. I don't know. There's a pharma that has a treatment coming down the pipe.
Right.
Are you collaborating back with the EMR side and with the folks who are at the facilities to sort of
Yes.
protocols and implement new ways to make sure in the, like there's patient lists and there's tracking and there's metrics, or is
Sure.
it just the real world data side?
No, we do have a pretty extensive disease management application as well. And here we have to be careful with the involvement of pharma, right? So like in terms of recommending medications or pointing them to specific treatment protocols, no, but it is more, the standard of care, that the American Diabetes Association recommends, or that, other bodies recommend that get, blessed by them. But there are some branded type education options. So we do have a full training module within PCC where people can go and learn about, branded meds and different options as well. The other thing we have is different sort of helpers around titration. So if you have a product that titrates, once the product has been prescribed, then we can be helpful in terms of how it gets, delivered. How does the patient, titrate it, as an example? So post prescribing, we can help, healthcare providers with a lot of education at that point. Is there, we don't have to worry about that influence.
And I can imagine, it takes evidence-based guidelines. You're not going to just take a manufacturer's guidlines to enter into new CDM.
Definitely can't do that.
Right.
Right.
But it sounds like sponsors can help, basically establish a build out that otherwise might not be funded because there isn't a mandate at any one site.
Yeah, that's really
might be a business model that could work. I know we've tried that with a couple different manufacturers, not in PointClickCare yet, more in Epic as an EMR. But I think I think like that seems to be a win-win for everybody when it aligns with the evidence-based guidelines.
Yeah, especially post decision. So once the therapy has been decided on, helping, because there are a lot of things that can happen. Like another example is we work with a med device company now that has a topical for diabetic ulcers, wound care, basically. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's required for reimbursement is to get the wound dimensions, right? They need to provide that to the pharmacy to make sure they get reimbursed. And even though our system has it, the way it was implemented was sort of a templated way, which I think less than 50% of the time was the pharmacy getting what they were supposed to. So we worked with this company to change the way we implemented that, such that over 90% of those orders were now being supplemented with the proper wound dimensions. Because what was happening is they were getting kicked back when they didn't have that. But again, post prescription, there's not a lot of restrictions on what we can do. But up until influencing it, all we can do in that case is provide you with sort of the landscape and where the problem exists, and then the manufacturer has to go in and work on that education. But post-prescribing, I think there's a lot we can do.
Another thing that I think people would object to, but we're not objecting to here, but I know that there's this challenge that your specialty EMR patients, normally when you think of an EMR, they're thinking of Cerner and Epic and these big EMRs. And they wonder, well, is all of the medical record sitting inside of PointClickCare, and how do you connect it to the claims data? Are you doing tokenization? Is that becoming, or is even necessary? Like, I don't have an opinion either way. I'm just wondering if that's.
It could be. I mean, we obviously, one of the things that happens if they get discharged to the hospital, right, then we lose them. If they come back, then, let's say they had a stent put in the hospital, we would have knowledge of that procedure. But if they left and didn't come back, we kind of lose them. So there can be a need to connect with other systems. And certainly we work with, the big token providers, Datavan, HealthVerity, and we've done a number of projects where, we're matching patients outside of the long-term care setting. And even in the commercial sense, there are some cases where connecting it to other, data sets makes sense. But typically it's the clinical data set where you want to look at a continued period of time, or you want to go back, 5-6 years. I think of dementia studies. You want to go back before they actually, had the diagnosis and see what the, what was going on with that patient. And that's typical. So yeah, we can do it. But I would say it's maybe 20% of our customers that do it. For the most part, our data set is is pretty clean. And I think we have the patients for a long enough period of time in many cases that, they can do some pretty interesting research.
Tell me about clinical trials. Do
Mhm.
people, I wonder about this
Very
population.
difficult, very difficult.
I'd imagine they're not the ideal population. They usually would be in the exclusion criteria, whatever got them into a long-term care facility.
It's typical that, if you're in a long-term care facility, you're probably listed in the exclusion criteria for the trial. But now, with the Depict Act, we're starting to see more inclusion of over 65, that they want these patients in the trials. And certainly depending on the trial, what you're studying, we may have, a predisposition to have patients in these settings. So we're doing one right now with Harvard and Pecori. I think I can talk about it. It's around osteoporosis bone fractures. And so we've used our network of facilities, to recruit. So we recruit at the organization level. They are going to be enrolling patients for us, right, into the study, getting the consent, and then we will bring them back. So, we can do it. We do have an offering to help clinical trial recruitment, but it's very high touch, right? You've got to have the facility's permission. Usually you do it at the org level. So you can, if you get a large enough organization that has thousands of facilities, you can get a good, concentration of patients, right? So they're, at least co-located in the same cities or geography, and then, let them help with the recruitment. It's difficult to get them to sign up. For this study, there was a lot of interest, so they did. But one of the major problems in long-term care, as you may know, is staffing. I mean, if you need them to lift a finger more than they're doing now, it's almost a non-starter. So it's a difficult environment, but there's a lot more demand than there has been in the past, given the fact that we need to have more of these, older populations included moving forward.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the requirement to be better represented
Yeah.
in clinical trials, because that keeps
Age is one of the, diverse. So if you don't include people in these age brackets, then you have to have a pretty solid justification for why not. And, in many cases, there's no good justification. And people are definitely different. Polypharmacy being one of the biggest, I think, differences. You've got to, figure out how to get them included. Not easy, but it's something that's more desirable now than it was a few years back.
I guess another thing about the LTC environment is very different than ambulatory, whereas, they go to the doctor, that's the data. These people are there all the time.
That's right.
The medical record may be a huge log of their life. What novel data have you seen end up in an LTC database that we just don't think about? Because it would be unheard of to get that kind of data.
Well, daily vitals is a big one. You don't see that everywhere, right? I mean, now I think more and more, with technology and, personal devices, I think that data is starting to become, more prevalent, but not consolidated the way we have. So daily vitals is a big one. Depending on your condition, I think a lot of the different, assessments that are out there, thinking mini mental exams, think MOCA exams, that kind of stuff. We have those longitudinally over time at a very, distinct frequency. So we probably at least have it monthly, but we may even have it weekly, right? Or things like ADL scores, or activities of daily living, which you may or may not be familiar. Just a score basically scores your ability to clothe yourself, feed yourself, ambulate, that kind of thing. And again, we have that, longitudinally. So it's not just one survey from the doctor visit, a year and a half ago. It's, every day for the last, year and a half. So, if you're trying to monitor the progression of dementia or Alzheimer's, these are the things that you're going to want to look at and how they're progressing, and compare that to the therapies or the different options that patients are on. So that's very unique to us, right? Because we do have these patients, in place for long periods of time in some cases, with very rich outcomes information.
Have you seen the life sciences companies? There's a whole bunch now that have a CNS, neuro, mostly neurodegenerative look on the world.
Yep.
Are they digging into this data, or is it still really?
I mean, some of them are. It's interesting to me that there's sort of the some are in and some are out, right? And it's, I've spoken to, both sides, and some of them are like, yeah, they're of the impression that once they hit a long-term care setting, they're too far gone and not that interesting for research. Whereas I think others take the another view, and they're like, no, they're still interesting, right? We're looking at therapies that slow down the impact of some of these diseases, so they're still interesting for us. Whereas others are looking at early stage detection and altering the disease before it starts. I think it is almost two different worlds. So some of them are not interested at all, and some of them are very interested. It's weird.
And are they doing natural history studies, comparative effectiveness? What's the nature of the things these?
Yeah, there's comparative effectiveness, just descriptive studies, just looking at the landscape, seeing, as we talked about, how often is it diagnosed, right? I mean, is it diagnosed as Alzheimer's or dementia, or is it something else? Is there symptoms that would lead you to believe that they should be diagnosed, right? Do they just have mild cognitive impairment diagnosed, but no dementia, no Alzheimer's? Like how is this being coded? How is this being looked at? And again, can we look at other proxies using the 50 plus observations we have on these patients a day? Is there another interesting way we can look at the data to help determine what the proper, percent of diagnosed patients should be, right? Versus just the ones coded. Age-related anorexia being the other. So the good example, are there many, many more patients that should be included in this cohort that just aren't because, again, given the setting, the providers just don't have enough time to code it properly.
Interesting. And are you seeing a lot of these other, there's so many different diseases that you get when you're older, things like cancer, heart failure, COPD. I mean, I would think you'd have every possible long-term chronic ailment represented.
Oh, we do. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as you would expect. So, I mean, oncology, we don't have a lot of oncology companies that are interested in our data because we don't have a good image database. So tumor imaging isn't something we do. There, you probably want to look at somebody like Flatiron who does that well. But I mean, we do have full, medication history. So we know, the therapies that they're using and the types of cancers. We just don't have a lot of detail in terms of, that tumor itself, which in many cases I think is important. So yeah, we haven't done any oncology studies yet. Even though, I mean, people are investing the most in life sciences there. It's not really our sweet spot. CNS is huge. I think diabetes is big, COPD, any kind of chronic respiratory condition is huge. Epilepsy is big for us now. But yeah, I mean, you name it, any chronic condition that's prevalent in long-term care is definitely, we have a patient population for sure.
And have you gotten involved in some of the rare diseases? Because I'd imagine you have just enough people to find.
We do. I mean, rare disease, again, depending on the rare disease, in many cases, if we have 4 or 5 patients, that's interesting to them, right? So, yeah, it's, give us a call, we can see, but depending on what you're looking for, it's easy enough for myself or anybody to search up and find out, how many patients we do have. So we do have a few rare diseases as well that are using our products.
And so is that how people start? They just call your office and say, how many patients do you have that match this cohort criteria?
Yeah. I mean, that's
back that data set.
That's how the first meeting goes. How many patients you got? And then they're either floored by it or, they're not interested and we walk away. But more often than not, we have more than enough patients to be interesting.
And what do you see as the big things coming up in the next few years? I mean, I guess we only talk every 3 years. So I wonder what we're going to be talking about 3 years from now that was exciting and new.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still hoping that the integration of digital health and our EHR is going to come together. I think given this population, the use of personal devices may not be as prevalent. Right? I'm thinking of things like diabetes and just measuring blood glucose. I mean, everybody seems to monitor that. But to this day, glucose readings, although they do get into our EHR, they're being done manually, right? But I see a world where a lot of this daily vitals or symptoms and behaviors are going to be captured digitally. And I think it's on us and our core EHR to make that a reality, to make this less of, it's going to help with the biggest problem in long-term care, which is staff related. If we can do more of this in an automated way and a real-time way, it's going to make the care we provide for these patients that much better in real time, and then also for research, because now we're going to have much better data in terms of quality and much more volume of data. But I look forward to that. I mean, I think if we can tie in our system to the phone, I mean, there's 4 or 5 companies that have the equivalent of a mini mental exam done through voice. So they can measure your voice over time, and they can tell you, what your mini mental score would be, or they have a proxy for it, which is like 99. It's more effective actually than the survey itself, right? So rather than asking them if this is a cat or an elephant, right? It actually just measures, you talking and the words that you're using, and the way that your voice is modulating to figure out whether you're actually being impacted. So stuff like that, where you can have like this passive sort of receptor of patient symptoms, kind of like the Star Trek tricorder, but on all times, coming back and feeding this source of data. I think I look forward to that. I don't think we're too far off from that, but I think that's what I see in the not too distant future.
Sounds pretty exciting. So you think this digital world with all these readings off the phone are going to come in? And
I think we have to tie it in.
Esoteric readings, right? The ones that
we have to tie in this sort of consumerism, sort of disease management into sort of our world of EHR. Like we have to tie those things together, and it's starting to happen, right? But I like to think of it as this is not a consumer app, but this is something that should be integrated, like everything, into the healthcare system, right? So that we can start to provide better care.
Well, one of the things it just makes me think is because you're smaller, like which could be considered a handicap. It's actually a huge advantage for innovation. So you have a very focused population of focused need, and if people start using voice biomarkers and start using it broadly within, long-term care, it could be 30 years before they start doing that for people who are 20. But they're trying to save resources any way they can in these elderly populations from the caregivers, and so these tools might be the first place you see them, and then these life sciences companies can translate them down into the rest of the world, but first in this more narrow space, and work it all out here. And it's great to hear about all your success, because I know it was pretty early when we first talked, and it sounds like you guys have built
I think
quite a lot of good use cases, right? And
this was our breakout year, I think, right? We got some more outbound business development people, right? And we went from like just me and Jason, and now we've got 5 people out there that are, just having these conversations, and that makes a big difference, right? We're going to have 7 next year. So, I think we identified, 350 therapies or drugs, new medications that we think should be more utilized in long-term care, and we're just going directly after them, telling that story at the brand level.
That's great too, because you're actually not just looking for business; you're looking to help the patients that are in the long-term care facilities. You're saying, hey, there's 350 medications that are underutilized. Let's talk to the manufacturers and see if they can invest. Because it's not easy for you guys to invest to change the world, but they can change the world with how they market and how they
change our little part of it. I feel like if I get up in the morning, I think if we can be a small part of curing a disease like Alzheimer's or one of the versions of it, that's a good reason to be making this stuff available. So I'm excited.
I'm a huge fan of better living through data.